The sermon this morning comes in the form of two interlacing stories. One is about a youth in our senior high group, and the other is this story from the Hebrew Bible that we just heard. But of course, in this sermon, as in every other sermon, I also invite you to listen for your own story, to pay attention to the places your heart is engaged, or the places your ego rebels, or the places that hit a little too close to home. Because we're all mirrors, and while the details may change, all of our stories are ultimately intertwined. I can remember the exact moment almost 2 years ago that I met Jamie. She was 14 years old and moving quickly towards me with all the grace of a newborn colt. She navigated the church lawn unsteadily in her high heels, moving the way only teenagers can, long limbs propelling her forward like a kid who has suddenly found herself in an adult-sized body and is still learning to drive this new contraption. She arrived with her mouth already moving a mile a minute as she asked her mom a question while simultaneously loudly chewing her gum. With long brown hair and freckles dusting the bridge of her nose, she was adorable, and I knew instantly that I would love this kid. A member of our youth group, as the weeks progressed, I got to know Jamie better. One-on-one, she was thoughtful, curious, playful, and quick-witted. But in larger groups, she was loud, dramatic, distractible, with a tendency to laugh just a little too emphatically. But as any of you who has ever hung out with a teenager knows, this is not an uncommon mix. In fact, Jamie reminded me a whole lot of my own teenage self. Which is why it still surprises me that it was months before I noticed something interesting about Jamie. Her left arm doesn't fully lift or extend, and she can't turn her palm all the way to face down. You see, Jamie has a form of palsy as a result of having her shoulder caught in the birthing process. The doctors literally had to rip her out before it became more severe. Her arm just hung there lifeless after she was born. She received physical therapy through most of her younger years and has recovered a great deal, but she still doesn't have a full range of motion. Once I noticed this, I began to see that there were a lot of activities that Jamie had to modify. And I started to worry about her. What if there was something in youth group that she couldn't do? Should I point it out and help her? Or should I let her keep her arm out of the limelight, but maybe take some flack for doing things differently? So I checked in with her mom, expecting her to speak solemnly about all that Jamie has had to struggle with. But instead, her mom brushed it off, saying, she's so strong and capable. I often forget there's anything she can't do. So I tried to let go of my fear, and instead I just remained curious. When I went to the Nutmeg dance recital, I noticed that Jamie was among the most elegant dancers. When she worked on Piper's youth farm crew for an entire season, she was among the hardest workers. When our youth group went with Rick Huggard to do a high ropes course, she was at the front of the line, and she wanted to try every element, even the ones she might have to modify. All the while, Jamie would pop her gum loudly, sassily tossing her head and drawing attention to her colorful personality and away from her arm. A couple of weeks ago, as you know, our youth group went on their annual mission trip to Appalachia. Having gone the previous year, I had watched Jamie nonchalantly use her hand backward to hold a nail, and then use her wrist and elbow to cut tile as she meticulously cut the flooring. I marveled at her innovation, but I knew that the other kids and adults who watched attributed these funky handholds to her quirky persona, sometimes even seeming annoyed that she wasn't following instructions. Then, on Wednesday evening, as we were sitting in the girls' dormitory, Jamie was responding to an email. As she typed, she used her right hand as expected, resting all 5 fingers on the keyboard. But on her left hand, she wrapped her fingers underneath the laptop to stabilize it, as her thumb flew along doing the work of the other 4 fingers. Another youth on the trip looked down and noticed Jamie typing and started to crack up. "Oh my gosh, look at the crazy way you type. Everybody, come look at Jamie." And with everyone gathered, that youth asked, "It looks so weird. Why do you do it like that? It's almost like you're texting with one of your hands. Do it again." So with a blush rising up into her freckled cheeks, Jamie kept typing. She typed something like, "Hey there, Bree, this is Jamie." Sitting behind her, I gently added, "Isn't it crazy amazing that Jamie's hand doesn't fully extend or turn, and yet most people never notice?" Gathered around her, the other 4 girls started asking questions in that open, authentic way that young people do. They asked her to show them how her hand worked. They marveled as she showed them her limited range of movement. One of the girls, with wide eyes, exclaimed, "How is it possible that I farmed with you all last summer and I never noticed this?" Another one said, "Seriously? Has it always been like this? How is it that I never noticed? It's almost like you have a secret superpower." Jamie continued to blush, but she also started to grin, shyly explaining the various ways she compensates. I chimed in, mentioning that Jamie comes to my yoga classes, and when the rest of us are in 3-legged dog with one leg straight up in the air, Jamie is actually balancing most of her weight on 2 limbs, something that would surely make me topple. Eventually, the conversation moved on, but I could tell that Jamie's peers were genuinely surprised and impressed by what they had learned. And I could tell that having her superpower received with so much love had pleased Jamie. And the thing is, Jamie is not the only youth with a story like this, quietly navigating the thing that makes her feel different. Some youth who have attended our youth group and ASP have struggled with disordered eating. Others have been hospitalized for depression. We have kids in our youth group with stutters that make them shy, and other kids who weren't born in this country and are ashamed of the other language they speak. We have kids being raised by a single parent and others in complicated blended families. We have kids who have had a parent die and others who are being raised by aunts and uncles. We have kids with learning disabilities, physical ailments, even a childhood survivor of cancer. It's a challenge to come up with a single youth who doesn't feel as though there is something about them that keeps them on the periphery and leaves them squarely outside the norm. And if the youth at our church have these stories, it's pretty much guaranteed that the adults in our community are carrying equally intense burdens. In our text for today, we have our protagonist, Jacob, who, like so many of the characters in the Bible, is a bit of an unlikely hero. Earlier in this story, he bought his brother Esau's birthright from him in exchange for a bowl of stew on a day that he was famished with weakness. He then colluded with his mother to cheat Esau out of his father's blessing, a blessing that rightfully belonged to the older son. From the get-go, it's clear that Jacob fears he won't be or have enough. And so he tricks and swindles his way into his abundance, using someone else's. Jacob's deception is about covering up his sense of vulnerability, the vulnerability in this case of being the younger child. And then, having tricked his own brother, Jacob must flee from home, running away to his mother's birth country to find a wife. But that old saying, what goes around comes around, is borne out as the story unfolds. In this new land, Jacob immediately falls in love at first sight with the youngest daughter of his maternal uncle. He goes to Rachel's father to ask for her hand in marriage, but his uncle Laban makes a deal. If Jacob works for him for 7 years, he can marry his daughter. But after 7 years of work, Laban tricks Jacob into marrying his older daughter, only then to have to work another 7 years to finally marry his beloved Rachel. And then, with 2 wives and a mess of children, Jacob needs a livelihood, so he stays on for another 6 years to earn himself livestock. Throughout this whole process, Laban and Jacob are trying to trick one another, and we see a family culture of trickery trying to mask a fear of scarcity. Finally, 20 years after his arrival in this new land, Jacob, who has now experienced being both a trickster and the tricked, sets out to return to his homeland. Because of the rupture in his relationship with his father-in-law, he has to sneak the whole caravan of people and livestock out of town in the middle of the night. So now we have Jacob, who had to run away from his childhood home, running away from his second home. And while the text doesn't say this, I would imagine that Jacob has begun to do some soul searching about the role dishonesty has played in his life. So he journeys home to finally face his brother. And I would imagine that he's feeling truly vulnerable. After all, his brother could easily have him killed for what he did. In a final effort to protect himself, he sends his servants ahead bearing gifts, hoping to quell his brother's anger. When he and his family come to the banks of the river Jabbok, he sends them across. But that night, he doesn't cross. Instead, he's left alone with his thoughts, with his feelings, with his vulnerability and fear bubbling up to the surface. And here's where it gets a little strange. Left on the lonely banks of the river, we're told that Jacob spends the night wrestling with a man that I can only imagine is God or an angel. So now I have to pause here and ask you, how many of you has ever spent a night like this? Your life has taken you through a variety of twists and turns that have allowed you to see yourself more clearly, maybe even from an angle you would rather not see. And then finally, there's no place to run to. There are no further distractions, and you're left alone with your fear and vulnerability and no option but to finally process it. There's no escape. And so you wrestle with God for your life, trying to figure out who you are and what you're made of. When morning finally breaks, there you are, exhausted, wounded, but alive. And if you're lucky, in the light of a new day, you see something about yourself that you didn't know was there before. You know that despite your vulnerability, you are holy and you deserve to be blessed exactly as you are. Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So Jacob spent the night wrestling with God, and in so doing, he wrestled with his deepest vulnerability. But in the end, he prevailed. And he saw for the first time that he didn't need a stolen identity or any kind of trickery to win. He was enough, all on his own, and he was worthy of his very own blessing from God. And from this point on in the story, Jacob is changed. His original name, Jacob, which means supplanter, or one who is holding on to someone else's heel, is replaced. His new name, Israel, means he who prevails with God. And from this point on, his life focus shifts. He's no longer thinking only about himself, but he becomes the father of a nation of people. Previously, Jacob gained power through dishonesty born of his fear of scarcity. But when he finally wrestles with this fear and accepts his vulnerability, he is finally able to receive God's blessing and step into his greatness. Likewise, Jamie was confronted with her vulnerability, her fear of not being enough when her friends noticed her unique typing style. And yet through their witness, the nature of her wound was transformed into an acknowledgement of her strength, a strength that had been there all along, just waiting to be blessed. And this type of transformation is not just possible for Jacob or Jamie, it's possible for every single one of us. As humans, we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable to desire, we're vulnerable to longing, for material wealth, for external beauty, for power and prestige, for admiration, or even just simple acceptance. And we all struggle to accept these vulnerabilities, this sense of powerlessness. But I think that what we're actually wrestling with is God. We're wrestling with a God who does not play by our rules and who doesn't give us the life we think we would like to be living. And yet, as impossible as it sounds, the wrestling is vital work. For until we admit that we are vulnerable now, and we always will be, we cannot receive God's blessings for our unique gifts, the ones we are already carrying into the world. Author Brené Brown says, "Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerability is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, which are the experiences that make us most vulnerable in this life. Only when we are brave enough to explore our darkness will we discover the infinite power of our own light." And so as you leave this place today and you walk back into your lives, I encourage you to notice where you might be living in scarcity, tricking yourself into believing that you are not enough or that you need something that someone else has to be happy. Notice if there's vulnerability that you're suppressing. Notice the parts of you that are wrestling with God for fear that your life and gifts are insufficient. Notice the pieces of you that are sure they don't deserve to be blessed. In the end, Israel finally has to face his brother, the brother whose blessing he stole, whose birthright he swindled, the person who has seen the very worst parts of him. He braces himself for disaster and rejection. But listen to what the text tells us. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And then in response to the gifts he had sent ahead, Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." But Israel said, "No, please, if I find favor with you, then accept this present from my hand. For truly, to see your face is like seeing the face of God, since you have received me with such favor." I'm going to say that one more time. For truly to see your face is to see the face of God, since you have received me with such favor." And so our story ends 20 years after it began, 20 years after Jacob ran away like a coward, sure he had to steal what he thought he needed. And instead, he returns home to the open arms of his brother, finally able to see that he had enough all along, that they both did. And despite his limp, he is finally whole and truly blessed.